The afternoon sun fell softly upon the gardens of Rosewood Hall, painting the lawns in hues of gold and green. It was the sort of day that made one proud to live in an English village, where the tea was always hot, the gossip even hotter, and nothing ever happened that couldn't be discussed over a slice of Victoria sponge. Lady Agatha Redwell's annual summer fete was the social event of St. Mildred's-on-the-Green, and this year was no exception. The village folk had turned out in full force, dressed in their Sunday best, smiling politely as they balanced cucumber sandwiches and lemonade on fragile china plates. At the far end of the lawn, under a billowing white marquee, stood the centerpiece of the day's raffle, a magnificent antique clock, all mahogany and brass, with the name Rosewood Clock Makers, 1827 inscribed upon its face. It had once graced the drawing-room of the late Colonel Redwell, whose military portrait still glared from above the fireplace inside the hall. Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles poised like twin sabres, sat primly in a cane chair beneath the shade of an old sycamore. She wasn't a woman given to excitement, but she had to admit there was something curiously compelling about that clock. Perhaps it was the way it ticked just a fraction too slowly, or perhaps, as she often told herself, it was simply the human element of timekeeping, the stories that lived behind every polished dial. "Lovely afternoon, isn't it, Miss Marple?" came the cheerful voice of Reverend Pritchard. His collar was slightly askew and his spectacles fogged with humidity. "Indeed, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, "though I always find these gatherings rather instructive. One learns so much from watching people when they believe they're only being sociable." Before the Reverend could puzzle out her meaning, a shrill cry sliced through the tranquil air. It came from the direction of the marquee. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, and the genteel chatter dissolved into startled murmurs. "Good heavens!" someone gasped. "It's Lady Agatha!" Miss Marple rose, steady but swift, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The crowd parted as she approached the source of the commotion. Lady Agatha lay sprawled beside the raffle table, her pale gloved hand resting limply against the base of the rosewood clock. Her hat had fallen off, revealing silver hair matted with blood. The timepiece above her ticked solemnly on. Each measured beat a whisper in the stunned silence. "She must have fallen," said Mrs. Carter, the baker's wife, her voice trembling. "Poor thing, tripped over the cord, no doubt." But Miss Marple was already looking at the clock, not at the face, but at the tiny door in its base, which hung slightly ajar, and through that narrow gap she glimpsed something glinting faintly inside. "Fallen, perhaps," Miss Marple murmured softly. "Or perhaps something or someone pushed her." The clock struck 4. Its chime rolled across the garden like a solemn bell for the dead. The hush that followed the chime was oddly delicate, as if even the bees suspended themselves in the lavender. Then sound returned in a rush, a sob from a maid who had come out with a fresh tray of scones, the scrape of the vicar's shoe as he knelt awkwardly, the murmur of instructions offered by those who had never given any in their lives. Mr. Hanmer, the butler, materialized with the quiet authority of a man who knows the difference between ceremony and calamity. He lifted the hem of Lady Agatha's silk jacket with 2 careful fingers, then let it fall again, his face pinched but composed. He did not touch the small ajar door in the clock's base, though his gaze flickered toward it as if the wood itself had spoken his name. Miss Marple did not push forward, for there is an art to being near without being noticed. "Reverend," she said mildly, "perhaps the guests might retreat to the cool shade by the hedges. A little room, you know, for Mr. Hanmer and the village nurse." The Reverend Pritchard straightened with relief at being told something to do. Yes, quite right. If we could," very gently. "Everyone, thank you, Mrs. Carter, over by the yew, that's it." People obeyed, not because he had authority, but because the elderly lady with the blue eyes and tidy hat had suggested something sensible in a voice without fuss. In the soft human tide moving away, opinions gathered like burrs on wool. "Heat stroke," murmured Mrs. Carter, who always preferred an everyday explanation that could be baked and cooled in a single afternoon. "Nerves," said Miss Lydia Forbes, the music teacher, tightening her shawl though the air was warm. She never recovered from the Colonel's passing. Grief comes upon one suddenly. "Or a step wrongly placed," added Mr. Whitstable the grocer, who had noticed the electrical cord snaking along the grass from the marquee to the band's little amplifier. "Trip up any lady," he announced with the certainty of a man who had never been a lady. At the edge of the gathering, Nina Bell, the florist with dark hair in a practical twist, clasped her basket to her waist and stared at the clock with a curious intensity that did not sit well upon her usually placid features. She thought of something, and then she thought better of thinking it. Inside the marquee, Miss Marple allowed herself one close look while Mr. Hanmer fetched Nurse Dalrymple from the tea-table. Lady Agatha's hand, gloved, lay near the base of the clock, as if seeking to steady herself upon it. A small smear of something colourless had been touched to the glove's fingertips, not earth, not dust, rather the sheen of a polish, perhaps, or oil. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the ajar door. Through its gap, a dull metallic glint kept company with shadow. It is well, she reflected, that certain objects like to be found only by people who notice them quietly. The nurse arrived, brisk and soft-spoken, and after a few moments of professional silence declared what everyone's expanding dread already knew. "She's gone." The words settled over the lawn like a light ash. Someone began to weep. Someone else coughed, as if to insist that lungs still functioned here, even if a heart had failed there. The village constable, young Barnes with a good nature and an unfortunate moustache that could not quite decide what it was growing into, presented himself in a hurry. He took statements with more earnestness than method and sent a boy on a bicycle to telephone headquarters for an inspector. He hovered near the clock, unsure if it was something to be guarded or ignored. "Best to keep fingers off, Constable," Miss Marple remarked, as though advising him about jam-setting times. "Old woods are so particular about the smears people leave upon them." Barnes blushed and drew himself up. "Thank you, miss," he said, and looked determinedly at the horizon. The guests dispersed in ones and twos, leaving behind the odd plate, a crushed bun, a hat forgotten on a chair like a social obligation abandoned. Gossip, however, did not disperse. It concentrated. By the time the inspector's motor car was heard along the lane, Mrs. Carter had confided to Mrs. Pritchard that she'd seen Lady Agatha arguing a week past with her nephew, Mr. Stephen Redwell, about certain arrangements, which meant money to some and wills to others. Mr. Whitstable had remembered, accurately or not, that Stephen had been sickly as a boy and sharp as a knife as a man. Nina Bell had said nothing at all, which Mrs. Grant, the schoolmistress, found to be the most suspicious response of all. Inspector Lennox was square-shouldered without being square-headed, a man troubled by loose ends and yet honest enough to admit that life mostly consisted of them. He listened to Barnes, took in the still figure near the clock, and surveyed the distance from the amplifier cord to the place where Lady Agatha had fallen. "Trip and fall," he pronounced slowly. "Possible." He stepped to the base of the clock and glanced at the small door. "What's this?" "Storage for winding keys, usually, sir," offered Mr. Hanmer without looking directly at Miss Marple. Colonel Redwell kept things tidy. Lennox nodded, bent and frowned at the door as if unsure whether to claim the satisfaction of discovery or the caution of restraint. He chose restraint. "Right then. No one touch this. Barnes, rope off the area. We'll want to ask a few questions." They began with Mr. Stephen Redwell, tall, elegant, and lately returned from London with an air of having seen too much of everything and not enough of anything in particular. He stood with his hands in his pockets and a calm that read to different spectators as innocence or arrogance according to their dispositions. "My aunt invited half the parish," he said, his voice pleasant and hollow. If someone tripped her, it's because the lawn is uneven and the maintenance funds have been shamefully diverted to geraniums. I've said so." "Your aunt disagreed?" Inspector Lennox asked. "She disagreed with the notion of anything being other than as she wished it to be." A smile formed and faded. "You see how that turns out." Miss Marple watched the young man's face, not for what it showed, but for what it refused to consider. Stephen did not once look at the clock. A curious omission, she thought, for a man so keen on the costs of keeping time. Nina Bell, when brought forward, twisted the strap of her basket so tightly that a creak ran along the leather. "Lady Agatha was particular about flowers," she said. "She'd wanted white roses by the marquee, and I told her white would look too stark against the tent. She said, 'I did not ask for advice, Miss Bell. I asked for roses.'" Nina's eyes moistened, but the tears did not fall. She looked toward the clock at last, and the look was both wary and drawn. The Colonel's pride, that clock. He used to say it could outlast anyone. "Did Lady Agatha have enemies?" Lennox asked. "Envy and enemies are cousins," Nina replied quietly, and the inspector, who had not expected poetry, wrote it down anyway. By late afternoon, clouds had thinned to a pearl veil, and the lawn wore the disarray of an interrupted dream. Under the nurse's guidance, Lady Agatha was borne inside. Lennox, having secured the marquee, asked that the staff remain available for further questions. Mr. Hanmer gave assent with the gravity of a ship's captain agreeing to weather. Miss Marple, who had said very little and been noticed still less, drifted toward the marquee again as the inspector spoke with Barnes. She crouched, not close enough to seem meddlesome, but near enough to observe the grass at the clock's plinth. A faint scuff showed where a foot had braced, not outward, as in tripping, but inward, as if someone had stood their ground with intent. In the compressed earth she saw the ghost of a narrow sole. Not the broad, sensible shoe of a matron, nor the polished heel of a gentleman. Something in between. She did not measure. Human memory does not require inches when it has pattern. She smiled, just barely, at the contrariness of people. A child's kite string, abandoned near the hedge, snagged her skirt. She freed it and noticed a smear on the string, another whisper of the same colorless sheen she had seen on Lady Agatha's glove. Furniture polish clings, she reflected, to the unlikeliest social companions. Evening began to tease the edges of the garden when Lennox approached her with a courtesy that was half genuine and half strategic. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I've heard you keep your eyes open in St. Mary Mead." "Eyes open are very handy for not stepping into puddles," she agreed, "and for seeing where someone else doesn't wish you to look." He followed her gaze to the clock. "You've a thought about that?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, with the most gentle of contradictions. "Only that it has been central to so many afternoons at Rosewood Hall, and today it has been central again. Objects are like people, Inspector. They acquire characters, and characters have habits." He grunted, half amused, and moved away to speak with Stephen Redwell once more. As they talked, Nina Bell lingered near the marquis's entrance, watching them both with a complicated expression, fair threaded with relief, like a ribbon woven through a wreath. The hour drifted towards 6. The village would soon return to its kettles and its conversations. But they would speak now not of the weather or the vicar's sermon, but of how quickly a gentle hand can become still, and how a clock, however venerable, cannot prevent a moment from arriving when it is most unwelcome. And Miss Marple, who had known this for many years, smoothed her skirt and fixed in her mind the small things that other people had chosen not to notice. A narrow scuff in the grass, a sheen upon a glove, a door ajar that should have been shut, and a florist who had looked at a clock as if she'd remembered a promise she had never meant to keep. The following morning dawned over St. Mildred's-on-the-Green with a hesitant sort of light, the kind that struggles through thin clouds and half-closed curtains. It was a quiet hour, the time of milk deliveries and kettle steam, yet every household seemed already awake. The news of Lady Agatha Redwell's death had flown faster than the dawn, whispered over fences, carried on the clatter of teacups, and embroidered with each telling. What had begun as a fall had, by breakfast, turned into murder. By the time the church clock struck 8, the word poison had been spoken in 3 kitchens and 1 shop, though no one could say what made them think so. Miss Marple, never one to indulge in idle sensationalism, sat by her window with a neat tray and her knitting. She had attended the early service, where the Reverend Pritchard, trembling at his own solemnity, had prayed for the departed soul of our esteemed benefactress. She had noted that Nina Bell, the florist, had not attended, nor had Stephen Redwell, but Mr. Hanmer the butler had been there, sitting bolt upright in a pew, his expression immovable, the very picture of duty under strain. Miss Marple had been long acquainted with that particular sort of restraint. It always concealed something, whether grief, guilt, or the effort of remembering precisely what one ought not to say. Outside, a motor car backfired in the lane. Inspector Lennox had returned to Rosewood Hall with his constable. The inquest would take place in a day or 2, but meanwhile the police had questions enough to last until tea. Miss Marple did not intend to intrude. Still, she found that her morning walk led her quite naturally toward the Hall. A woman of her age could visit the grieving household without impropriety, especially if she brought a jar of damson jam and a modest expression of sympathy. When she arrived, she found the grand drive strangely subdued. The banners and ribbons from yesterday's fete hung limp, the grass showing faint wheel marks where tables had stood. A gardener gathered wilted blooms into a barrow with a melancholy air, as though each blossom were another small confession. Miss Marple greeted him kindly. "Sad business, Mrs. Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Can't make sense of it. Her ladyship was fine as ever, scolded me not 2 hours before about the roses." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "Roses can stir such strong feelings in people. They prick when one least expects it." He smiled faintly, uncertain, and she moved on toward the house. In the hall she was met by Mr. Hanmer, whose composure looked even more deliberate in daylight. "You are most considerate, ma'am," he said. "Her ladyship will be much missed." "I dare say she will," Miss Marple replied. "It must be quite a strain upon you, Mr. Hanmer, having the constable asking questions before the tea things are even cleared." "A servant must be prepared for any duty," he said, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. "Inspector Lennox is thorough. I'll give him that." He ushered her into the morning room, where the scent of polish lingered, the same faintly acrid tang Miss Marple had noticed on Lady Agatha's glove. The inspector himself stood by the fireplace, a notebook in hand. Stephen Redwell leaned against the mantel, elegant and remote, while Nina Bell sat on a stiff chair near the window, her fingers twisting a handkerchief to threads. "Miss Marple," Lennox greeted, half surprised, half respectful. "You saw the incident yesterday. Anything you've recalled overnight that might help us?" She set down her jar of jam upon a side table. "Only that people often notice what is large and overlook what is small. It's the small things that show how a day turns wrong." "Such as?" he asked, pen poised. "Well," she said mildly, "I did notice Lady Agatha's glove. It had a little smudge of something upon it, like the polish one uses on wood, and the same smell seems to be about this room." Stephen gave a short laugh. "The place is cleaned within an inch of its life every morning. My aunt liked everything to gleam. You'll find polish on every surface." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "though it's curious how certain scents attach themselves more readily to some objects than others. Clocks, for instance." Lennox glanced up. "You've been thinking about that clock?" "It's hard not to, Inspector. It rather dominated the occasion." He frowned slightly. "We examined it this morning. Nothing remarkable inside. Just the mechanism and a little winding key. No poison dart, no hidden pistol, no trap door, I'm afraid." Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, but people do like to hide things in plain sight, don't they?" The colonel, I'm told, was a methodical man. He would not have tolerated a clock that ran a fraction slow unless it served some purpose. Stephen shifted, impatience flickering across his expression. My grandfather was eccentric. He claimed that clock could tell more than time, that it could keep secrets. I suppose you'll make a parable of that, Miss Marple. I find parables most enlightening, Mr. Redwell, she said pleasantly. They reveal what one believes about people, not about clocks. Lennox closed his notebook. We'll know more when the doctor's report comes. She might have struck her head when she fell. Miss Marple inclined her head. Or before she fell. Her words hung like faint mist. Nina Bell looked up suddenly, eyes wide, then lowered them again. The inspector noticed, but said nothing. After a few more formalities, Miss Marple excused herself. Outside she paused by the marquee, now half dismantled. A few fragments of bunting flapped weakly in the breeze. Beneath the table where the raffle prizes had been arranged, she noticed something small, a torn scrap of ribbon, deep crimson with a faint trace of waxy substance along its edge. She picked it up delicately in her handkerchief. The same scent again, polish, unmistakable. She tucked it away before anyone saw. As she turned down the path toward the gate, she nearly collided with Mrs. Carter, breathless with excitement. They say the inspectors found fingerprints on the clock, the woman announced, her eyes bright with the relish of tragedy. Real fingerprints from that florist girl, Nina Bell. Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly. Well, she did arrange the flowers by the clock yesterday. One would expect her fingerprints, wouldn't one? Mrs. Carter blinked, as though this explanation had quite spoiled her thrill. You don't think she did it? I think, said Miss Marple, that when something dreadful happens, we all look for the person who seems most out of place. But wickedness, Mrs. Carter, is very good at looking ordinary. The woman looked unsettled. Well, I'll say my prayers for her, all the same, she muttered and bustled off down the lane. By noon the clouds had thickened again, as though the sky itself disapproved of gossip. Miss Marple walked home, her mind quietly sifting. A fall, a smear of polish, a clock running slow, a nervous florist, a nephew who looked away at just the right times, pieces that did not yet fit but refused to be discarded. She reached her gate just as the post arrived. A circular from the Women's Institute, an advertisement for carpet soap, and a small square envelope addressed in a fine, uncertain hand. She opened it with care. Inside lay a single sheet, blank except for one line written in neat, deliberate script. The clock strikes where the heart stops. There was no signature. Only the faint trace of rose scent on the paper, Lady Agatha's favorite perfume. Miss Marple stood quite still in her hallway, listening to the ticking of her own modest mantel clock. Somewhere, deep within the rhythm of those steady seconds, she felt the first unmistakable stirrings of the truth, not yet visible but alive, like the faint rustle of wings before a storm. Miss Marple stood in her hallway a long while, the letter trembling faintly between her fingers. It was not fear that made her hand unsteady. Miss Marple was long past the age for that. But recognition. She had seen such deliberate gestures before. The anonymous message, the poetic turn of phrase meant to unsettle, the arrogance of a mind that enjoys its own cleverness. Yet this was written not by an outsider seeking to taunt, but by someone who understood precisely how the village breathed, how whispers traveled, how the air of St. Mildred's carried secrets better than sound. She set the letter gently upon her table, beside her spectacles, and regarded it as if it were a specimen under glass. The clock strikes where the heart stops, she murmured, the words quiet and deliberate. It was neither a confession nor a threat, but a statement of timing, a riddle of rhythm. The killer, whoever they were, wished her to know they had an appreciation for both detail and irony. By late morning, the village was thick with speculation. Mrs. Carter had told Mrs. Grant that Nina Bell had been seen crying near the post office, which Mrs. Grant interpreted as the surest sign of guilt. The Reverend Pritchard attempted to calm the talk, reminding his congregation that false witness is a grave sin, but even he could not resist confiding to his wife that the florist had seemed unnaturally pale of late. In St. Mildred's, innocence was merely guilt unproven. Miss Marple, however, found her thoughts circling not around Nina Bell, but around Polish. She had seen it in too many places, on the glove, the ribbon, the clock. She knew, as only someone who had polished furniture for 70 years could, that such sheen did not appear by chance. It clung, it lingered, and it betrayed the touch of whoever applied it. That faint, acrid smell was the scent of diligence, or of disguise. Shortly before luncheon, she walked again toward Rosewood Hall. The inspector, she knew, would not thank her for returning, but she had always found that men investigating crimes tended to overlook the quieter witnesses. The maids, the gardeners, the cook. They noticed everything because no one noticed them. In the servants' passage, Miss Marple found young Alice, the housemaid, carrying a pail of water, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple offered her a kind word and, after a moment's sympathy about how hard sudden death could be, asked whether Lady Agatha had seemed ill the day before. "Oh, no, ma'am," Alice said quickly. "She was right sprightly, she was. Told me off for polishing the wrong vase in the drawing-room. Said the clock needed attention instead, and to tell Mr. Hanmer to see to it before the guests arrived." "The clock," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Did Mr. Hanmer do as he was told?" "I don't rightly know, ma'am," the girl admitted, "but I did see him come out of the drawing-room just before luncheon with a cloth in his hand. I thought he'd done it himself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He's a devoted servant, I'm sure." "Been here longer than anyone," Alice said. "Knew the colonel from before the war, the kind that runs the house proper." That, Miss Marple reflected, was exactly the kind of man who understood both the value of time and the danger of secrets. She thanked the girl and walked on. Inspector Lennox was in the library, looking harassed. He had just finished questioning Nina Bell again and was no closer to satisfaction. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression hovered between resignation and relief. "You again," he said. "I suppose I should have known." "People do tend to find me persistent," she agreed pleasantly. "I thought you might like a small observation about Lady Agatha's habits." "I'll take any observation at this point," he said, setting down his pen. "She was meticulous, yes?" Miss Marple said, "and rather fond of keeping up appearances. A woman like that wouldn't leave an heirloom clock untidy for long. If it was smudged, she'd see to it, or have someone else do so." He looked at her keenly. "You think the clock was tampered with before the fete?" "I think it was touched more recently than anyone admits," she said. "By someone who understood its importance, perhaps even more than Lady Agatha herself." Lennox rubbed his temple. "The butler? Or someone acting under his instruction? Servants follow routines, Inspector. It's when those routines are interrupted that one must pay attention." He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned forward. "Miss Marple, you said yesterday you noticed something glinting inside that clock. What did you think it was?" "Metallic," she said after a moment. "Perhaps a key, perhaps not. It had the look of something kept secret for too long." He was about to press her further when a sharp knock interrupted them. Barnes entered, flustered. "Sir, the coroner's report just came through." Lennox opened the envelope, scanning quickly. His brows lifted. Well, head wound, yes, but there's also evidence of a blow delivered before the fall. Not an accident, then." He looked up at Miss Marple. "You were right. Murder." The words settled heavily in the air, though Miss Marple merely inclined her head as though acknowledging an inevitable conclusion. "And the instrument?" "Something blunt, not heavy," Lennox read. "Likely an object close at hand, possibly wood or brass." "The clock," Miss Marple murmured. He stared at her. "You think she was struck with the clock?" "Not with it, perhaps," she said gently, "but near it, and perhaps by the hand that wound it last." Before he could reply, Barnes burst out again. "Sir, Miss Bell's gone. The florist, she's disappeared." "What?" Lennox stood at once. "When?" 10 minutes ago, maybe less. She was waiting in the side hall while we finished here. Windows open, her bicycle's gone." Miss Marple's knitting bag rustled softly as she rose. "Fear makes people flee, Inspector," she said, "but guilt makes them hide. We must be sure which we are chasing." They hurried outside, but the lane beyond Rosewood Hall was already empty. Only the faint wheel marks of a bicycle curved through the damp dust, leading toward the village. Miss Marple knelt, tracing them with a gloved hand. They wobbled once, veered slightly toward the ditch, then steadied again. A nervous rider, not one accustomed to haste. "She'll go to her shop," Lennox said. "Or try to." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but frightened people often seek familiarity, and she looked yesterday at that clock as though it held something she recognized. I wonder if she's gone not away, Inspector, but back." Lennox frowned. "Back? Back to where the story began," Miss Marple said softly. "To where the clock first learned to whisper." He stared at her, uncomprehending. But Miss Marple was already walking down the lane, her small figure composed and unhurried, following the faint impression of bicycle tracks toward the village, her mind ticking as steadily as any timepiece in Rosewood Hall. Somewhere, she was certain, the rhythm of the truth had already begun to sound, and if one only listened carefully enough, the next stroke would come exactly on time. The lane wound between hedgerows heavy with summer dust, and Miss Marple followed the bicycle tracks with patient eyes. They wavered as she'd seen, veering once toward the ditch and again to the crown of the road before vanishing near the turning toward the old mill. It was quiet there, the kind of hush that comes when birds pause mid-song, as though the air itself is waiting. She stood a moment, her gloved hand resting lightly on her walking stick, and considered what she knew. Fear drove one forward in a straight line. Guilt circled back to the scene it wished to undo. Nina Bell had not fled aimlessly. She was drawn toward something she could not leave behind. Miss Marple crossed the stile that led to the path behind Rosewood Hall. The trees thickened here, the smell of moss damp beneath their shade. A squirrel darted along the low wall, scattering bits of lichen. Beyond the copse lay the churchyard, familiar, solemn, and very near to the florist's cottage. The proximity was telling. People seldom choose to live near what they fear, unless they are bound to it. As she approached, she saw the bicycle leaning against the low gate, its front, wheels still turning faintly in the breeze. The cottage door stood ajar. From inside came the faint sound of water running. Miss Marple, who never entered another person's home without invitation, nonetheless stepped quietly to the threshold and called softly, "Miss Bell, it's Jane Marple. Are you quite well, my dear?" There was no reply, only the soft dripping of a tap left open. She stepped inside. The small front room smelled of roses and damp earth. Bouquets lay scattered across the counter, half arranged, half abandoned. A letter lay on the table beside a cup of cold tea. On it was the florist's name, written in a hand Miss Marple recognized at once. Lady Agatha's, neat and looping. The letter was unsealed, and its contents brief. "My dear Miss Bell, I would appreciate your discretion regarding the arrangement delivered last week. The white roses are to remain between us. Speak of it to no one." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the last words. The ink had blurred slightly, as though by a tear or perhaps by haste. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her handbag, her mind ticking forward. There were few reasons for a lady of Agatha's standing to request secrecy over a bouquet. Fewer still that might end with death beneath a clock. A soft sound behind her, a creak of floorboard, made her turn. Nina stood there, pale and trembling, her dark hair loose from its pins. There was soil on her hands and a wild, sleepless look in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she breathed, "you shouldn't have come." "My dear, I was concerned," Miss Marple said gently. "Running away only makes the fearful seem guilty. Sit down, won't you? We can talk while I put the kettle right." Nina shook her head, backing a step. "They'll think I killed her. Everyone already does." Miss Marple moved no closer, merely adjusted the teacup on the table. "People often prefer simple answers, my dear, but the truth is rarely simple. Why did Lady Agatha wish to keep her roses secret?" Nina hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the window. "She ordered them herself, not for the fete, but the week before. She wanted white roses, but not for display. I delivered them to her personally. She took them to the drawing room, said she'd keep them near the clock. She made me promise not to tell anyone she'd bought them." "And did you promise?" "I did. She said it was for remembrance. For the Colonel." Miss Marple's tone softened. "A woman keeps strange mementos when she's alone. Did she say why that particular day?" Nina swallowed. "The anniversary of his death, but—" She stopped herself abruptly, her fingers clutching at her skirt. "But something troubled you," Miss Marple prompted gently. "She had me place a small vial in the water with the roses," Nina whispered. "Said it was to keep them fresh. It smelled like polish, only stronger. I asked what it was, and she laughed. Said it was Times perfume. I didn't think of it again until she fell." Miss Marple felt a cool ripple of comprehension. "And afterward, you found the vial gone?" Nina nodded miserably. "After the party, I went to the hall this morning to ask the butler about it, but I heard the inspector was there. I got frightened. I didn't mean to run." "You were wise to trust your fear, but unwise to obey it," Miss Marple said kindly. "Now, did you tell anyone else about that vial?" "No one. Only you now." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the church tower rose beyond the trees. The clock on that tower struck the half-hour, each note echoing through the air like a measured reminder. "Then someone else knew of it," she said softly. "Someone who used your harmless act to conceal their own." There was a sudden commotion outside, gravel crunching under heavy boots. Inspector Lennox appeared at the gate, Barnes close behind. Nina went white. "They've come for me," she whispered. "Not if I can help it," Miss Marple said calmly. "Inspector, do come in. We were just having a most enlightening conversation." Lennox stepped inside, his expression wary. "Miss Marple, I hope you haven't been encouraging flight from the law." "On the contrary," she replied serenely. "I've been encouraging honesty. Miss Bell has told me something that may interest you greatly." In a few brief sentences, she repeated the tale of the roses, the vial, and Lady Agatha's peculiar secrecy. Lennox listened, his brow furrowing deeper. So the Polish scent wasn't just polish, and the fluid, if it were corrosive or toxic, it could have caused dizziness or worse if she handled it. Or if someone replaced the contents with something more deadly, Miss Marple said. Perhaps a servant who knew where the vial was kept, or a relative who stood to inherit more quickly. "Stephen Redwell," Lennox muttered. "He's been impatient to sell the estate." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But don't forget Mr. Hanmer. He knew every routine in that house, every drawer and key, and he, too, polished that clock." Lennox turned to Barnes. "Bring Hanmer in for questioning." "Quietly." Nina sagged into a chair, trembling with relief and dread in equal measure. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Courage, my dear. The truth has a way of appearing just when those who fear it think they've hidden it best." As the inspector left, Miss Marple glanced again at the note she had found. The white roses, the polished scent, the clock, all threads woven by the same hand. Outside, the breeze stirred the branches, carrying with it the faint toll of the church bell. The sound was steady, measured, inevitable, like a heartbeat beneath the hush of the village. And Miss Marple, listening to it, knew that the clock of Rosewood Hall would strike again before the day was done. And when it did, it would not be time that stopped, but pretense. Inspector Lennox returned to Rosewood Hall that evening with a purpose that was almost visible in his stride. The light was fading, turning the house's stone facade to a bruised grey, and in that dimness it looked less like the seat of generations and more like a place that had been waiting for its secrets to come due. Miss Marple followed at a slower pace, her calm step in deliberate contrast to the urgency of the men ahead. She had spent the afternoon in thought, the kind of quiet sorting that required neither paper nor pen. Her conclusions were forming, though she knew better than to trust them too soon. Truth, in her experience, always came wrapped in courtesy and contradiction. Inside, the hall was hushed. A single lamp burned low in the drawing-room, throwing a sheen over the brass fittings of the Rosewood Clock. The old timepiece had been moved from its place near the window to stand beneath the portrait of the colonel, as though brought before its master for judgment. Mr. Hanmer stood beside it, hands clasped neatly behind his back, every inch the composed servant. Yet his eyes, Miss Marple saw at once, were not still. They flickered toward the clock face at intervals too regular to be accidental, like a man waiting for the hour to strike. Lennox wasted no time. "Mr. Hanmer, you've served the Redwell family a long time." 42 years, sir. "And in all that time, you've seen Lady Agatha manage this estate, hold fetes, entertain half the county. You'd say she was a strong woman." "Stronger than many men, if I may," Hanmer said, "and more exacting than most." Lennox nodded. "You polished that clock on the morning of the fete?" "Yes, sir, as instructed." "Did you notice anything unusual? A vial among the flowers, perhaps?" For a moment, the butler's face was unreadable. Then came a faint tightening of the mouth. "I did remove a small bottle from behind the clock base, yes. It was misplaced, I thought. I assumed it contained scent or oil. I put it away." "Where?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Hanmer hesitated just long enough for the answer to matter. "In the drawer of the sideboard." Lennox turned to Barnes, who opened the drawer. Inside, among neatly folded napkins, lay a small glass vial. It was half full of a cloudy liquid and sealed with a cork darkened by oil. Lennox lifted it gingerly. So it was still here. "It appears so, sir," Hanmer said. His composure wavered only slightly as Lennox handed the vial to Barnes, though I'm sure I placed it farther back. Miss Marple studied the clock as the men spoke. The polish gleamed along its carved edges, smooth as a mirror. But near the small door in its base, she saw what she had noticed before, a faint irregularity, a nick where the varnish had worn thin. Someone had opened that door often and recently. She bent slightly, pretending to admire the craftsmanship. "You've kept it very well, Mr. Hanmer. The colonel would be proud." Hanmer inclined his head. "The colonel valued punctuality, ma'am. He said a clock must always tell the truth, even when people do not." "How very wise," she murmured. "And yet sometimes the truth lies not in what the clock tells, but in who winds it." Lennox glanced at her with faint impatience, but she went on softly, almost to herself. "Lady Agatha had the clock wound each day at noon, did she not?" "Yes, ma'am," Hanmer replied. "I always did so myself." "Ah." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the pendulum, which swung with perfect precision. "Yesterday, though, I noticed the chime struck 4 minutes late. You must have been interrupted." Hanmer's gaze hardened. "If you please, ma'am, I did not fail in my duties." "No, indeed," Miss Marple said kindly, "but someone else might have taken it upon themselves to help. A loyal servant's task performed by another hand is often the beginning of mischief." Lennox straightened. "Are you suggesting someone tampered with the clock?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that when Lady Agatha fell, She was standing beside it for a reason. Not to admire the roses or draw tickets, but because she noticed something amiss. Her eyes met Hanmer's, calm but unyielding. She would never allow her clock to run slow. A bead of sweat traced its way down the butler's temple. "You think I think Lady Agatha confronted someone by that clock," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone she trusted. She may have reached to open the door and seen what was hidden there." Lennox seized upon the thread. What was hidden? The vial, perhaps, or something that belonged to it. Her gaze dropped to the base of the clock. "Might we open it again, Inspector?" Lennox crouched, prizing the tiny door open with care. Inside was a hollow space lined with dust and the faint gleam of brass. And there, just behind the pendulum's mechanism, lay a small wad of cotton, discolored and damp. Lennox touched it with the tip of his pencil, sniffed and recoiled. Smells of polish and something else. Bitter. "Prussic acid," Miss Marple said quietly. "A gardener's poison, colorless, swift and dreadful. Mixed with polish, it could be handled without suspicion, until the vapor escaped." Lennox stared at her. "Then whoever cleaned the clock was exposed," she finished gently. "If Lady Agatha took the cloth from Hanmer or tried to polish it herself, she would have inhaled enough to make her dizzy. A moment later, she'd fall." Hanmer's face had gone chalk white. "I didn't mean—" He stopped himself too late. Lennox turned sharply. "You didn't mean what, Hanmer?" The old man's composure broke like glass. "I only meant to frighten her. She was going to sell the hall, dismiss the staff. 40 years, gone like dust. I'd tended that. House longer than her nephew ever set foot in it. She laughed at me, said I'd have my notice by Michaelmas. I wanted her to see how fragile time can be. I never thought she'd touch it herself." Miss Marple's eyes were grave but not unkind. "People seldom think death will come from a gesture so small, but poison, like secrets, has a way of escaping its bottle." Lennox nodded grimly to Barnes. "Take him in." As they led the trembling butler away, the great clock struck the hour. Its chime was deep, measured, unhurried, the voice of something older than guilt or grief. Miss Marple stood listening, her face calm in the glow of lamplight. "You see, Inspector," she said quietly, "the clock was honest after all. It only told the time of truth." Outside, the last of the daylight faded behind the yews. The hall stood silent once more, its windows reflecting the slow pulse of the pendulum within. And in the hush that followed, Miss Marple could almost hear it still, each tick like a whisper through rosewood, reminding her that in every crime, as in every life, the smallest hands always tell the largest truths. The morning after Mr. Hanmer's arrest broke pale and heavy with mist. St. Mildred's on the Green felt oddly hushed, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The newspapers hadn't yet arrived, but rumor had already done its work. The faithful butler, the poisoned Polish, the tragic mistake. Every word grew softer with pity, sharper with certainty. Yet to Miss Marple, sitting at her small breakfast table with an untouched cup of tea, the story felt incomplete. There was a rhythm to wrongdoing, she often said, and this one was half a beat short. She reviewed what she knew as she knitted, one row for reason, another for doubt. Hanmer's confession had been genuine, yes, but sincerity was a common trait in liars and penitents alike. It was the simplicity of his tale that troubled her. 40 years of obedience could curdle into resentment, but not into calculated deceit. He had meant to frighten Lady Agatha, he'd said, but fright required presence. How had he been so sure she'd approach the clock that very afternoon, unless someone ensured it? The church bells struck 8, soft and uneven through the fog. Miss Marple stood, straightened her cardigan, and set out once more toward Rosewood Hall. She was not expected, nor was she unwelcome. The inspector, she suspected, would be there already, drafting reports and congratulating himself on a case neatly tied. yet neatness, in her experience, was rarely honest. When she arrived, she found the hall quieter than before. The servants had withdrawn, the doors stood open for air. Inspector Lennox was in the library, bent over the clock. He looked up with mild exasperation when she entered. "You do have a talent for returning at inconvenient hours, Miss Marple." "I find the truth keeps similar hours, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "May I?" He gestured toward the clock. "Hanmer's admitted everything. Said he soaked the cloth with diluted acid polish the night before. It fits the evidence perfectly." "It fits some of it," Miss Marple replied, stepping closer. "But the vial was half full when you found it. Wouldn't it have been empty if it had been used twice? Once to prepare, once to wipe. And where was the cloth he said he soaked?" Lennox blinked, then frowned. "We assumed he discarded it." "People who tidy for a living rarely discard anything out of place," she said mildly. "And yet there is no cloth. Only that wad of cotton you found, half hidden in the clock. A man like Hanmer would have folded his instruments, not stuffed them away." He studied her a moment. "You think he's covering for someone?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that guilt sometimes serves loyalty better than truth. Perhaps he believed he owed that much to the family." Before Lennox could answer, the door opened and Stephen Redwell entered. His tone was brisk, his expression too carefully neutral. "Inspector, I've come to collect a few papers of my aunt's, if that's permitted. I've a solicitor waiting in London." Lennox stiffened. "Not until the investigation's complete." Stephen smiled thinly. "Of course. One only asks." His eyes moved to Miss Marple, cool and assessing. "Still taking an interest, Miss Marple? You do make our village deaths sound like parlor puzzles." "Not puzzles," she said gently. "Patterns. There's a difference. Puzzles are meant to be solved. Patterns are meant to be understood." He chuckled softly, but his gaze dropped, just for an instant, to the clock. It was enough. Miss Marple followed that glance as surely as one might follow a compass. "Tell me," she said lightly, "did your aunt ever mention adjusting the clock? It's running precisely again now, though yesterday it lagged several minutes." Stephen shrugged. "I wound it last night before the police took it away from the wall. It was bothersome, ticking without purpose." Lennox looked up sharply. "You touched the clock?" "Merely wound it. I hardly think that criminal." "No," Miss Marple said, "but it's curious. One would think a man eager to leave for London wouldn't linger over an heirloom he intends to sell." Stephen's smile thinned. "Habit, perhaps. I dislike disorder." "Indeed," she said. "So did your aunt. It was disorder that killed her, in a sense. A small thing out of place, a clock that told time falsely. I wonder, if someone had meant to kill rather than frighten her, how convenient that would be. The poison hidden in polish, the servant blamed, and all for a lady who'd threatened to change her will only days before." He stared at her, the blood draining faintly from his face. "You've been talking to people who know too little," he said quietly. "My aunt was senile. She said many things she never meant." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but she wrote things she meant very much. There was a letter to the florist about roses and discretion, and another, unsigned, that found its way to my post. You see, I collect small correspondences as others collect coins. They tell me who fears discovery." Lennox stepped forward. "Miss Marple, are you implying—" "I am implying nothing," she interrupted mildly. "I am observing that someone must have known precisely where the vial was hidden. Hanmer did not, for he said he found it behind the clock. Yet Lady Agatha kept it inside. That means someone else handled it before the fete, and afterward, when you, Mr. Redwell, so helpfully wound the clock again." Stephen's poise faltered. "You have no proof." "Proof is the business of men," she said softly. "But the absence of polish on your left cuff, when every servant swore the cloth left a stain that lingered for hours, that is the business of observation. You cleaned it carefully, didn't you, after retrieving the vial to make certain Hanmer's story would fit?" The silence that followed was thick enough to hear the clock's pendulum beat between them. Lennox's hand moved toward his notebook, but Stephen spoke first, his voice low, brittle. "She wanted to leave it all to the church," he said. "After everything I'd endured for this family, the name, the debts. I'd meant it to look like an accident. Hanmer was old. He'd take the blame. She never should have touched the clock herself." Miss Marple's expression was grave, not triumphant. "Evil seldom requires intent, Mr. Redwell, only opportunity and pride." Lennox called for Barnes, the handcuffs glinting briefly as they took the young man away. The sound of the door closing left an emptiness that hummed against the ticking clock. When they were alone, Lennox exhaled. "You knew from the start?" "No," Miss Marple said, shaking her head. "I simply listened. Clocks and people both tell you the truth if you wait long enough for them to strike." Outside, the mist was lifting from the village, revealing roofs and chimneys with their thin spirals of smoke. The air smelled of damp earth and roses, faint but sweet. Miss Marple paused on the steps, looking back at Rosewood Hall. The great clock gleamed in the window, its hands steady once more. It would, she knew, keep perfect time now, for truth, unlike deceit, never runs slow forever. The following days passed with the uneasy calm that often settles over a village after a tragedy. Life appearing to resume its rhythm, yet every small sound seeming to echo longer than it should. Rosewood Hall stood silent under the soft drizzle, its clock ticking faithfully in the drawing-room once more. The servants had returned to their duties, subdued but grateful to have the ordeal ending. Yet to Miss Marple, who observed people as others might tend to their gardens, the atmosphere felt too settled, too still, as though something essential had been left unsaid. Inspector Lennox had departed for London with Stephen Redwell in custody, confident that justice had been served. The newspapers called it a crime of inheritance, their headlines steeped in admiration for the unassuming spinster whose keen feminine intuition had solved it. Miss Marple, reading those lines at her breakfast table, allowed herself a small sigh. It was never intuition, she thought, but observation, only no one ever wished to believe how much one could see by simply keeping quiet. Still, something lingered in her mind. The clock had struck true when the inspector left, its pendulum swaying evenly as though finally freed of deceit. But Miss Marple had learned that evil rarely departed with handcuffs. It left shadows, faint distortions in the ordinary pattern of life. That morning, she meant to pay one last visit to the hall, not as a detective, but as a woman who disliked loose threads. The hall's caretaker met her at the gate, grateful for company. "We'll close it up soon, Miss Marple. The lawyers say it'll go to auction. Seems a shame, such a fine old place." "It does indeed," she said. "But old houses are rather like old people. They prefer honesty to admiration. And I fancy Rosewood Hall has endured quite enough of the latter." Inside, the drawing-room was almost as it had been the day of the fete. The clock gleamed in its corner, reflecting the dim light from the tall windows. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her eyes tracing the curve of the rosewood case, the small brass inlay at its base. She touched it lightly with her gloved hand, feeling for the tiny nick she had noticed before. But something was different. The small scratch near the lower hinge had vanished, polished smooth. She bent closer, lips pursed. Someone had been here. A faint scuff on the floor, a mark from a shoe, large, masculine, caught her attention near the rug. She followed it toward the writing desk. The drawer was ajar by less than an inch, but it was enough to reveal the faint gleam of a key within. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a set of clockmaker's tools, wrapped in a soft linen cloth, and a folded letter bearing Stephen Redwell's seal. The sight of it made her brows lift slightly. The inspector had taken all correspondence into evidence. This, then, had been overlooked, or perhaps deliberately left behind. She unsealed it. The writing was Stephen's, though less composed than before, written in a hand that wavered with haste. If she discovers the alteration, it must be reversed. The spring cannot hold such tension. It will strike before the hour. Keep it steady, as we agreed, and all will pass unnoticed. Should anything occur, you know where to find me. Miss Marple read it twice, her frown deepening. The spring. The clock had been tampered with mechanically, not merely poisoned. A double safeguard, a blow and a poison, both timed to appear accidental no matter how death arrived. But who would keep the spring steady? Not Hanmer. He would never have risked damaging his beloved clock, and Stephen Redwell, now in prison, could not have returned to check it. There remained only one person who could still move freely through the house, one who might have been overlooked entirely in the shadow of greater names. She turned at the faint sound of a door closing in the hall. Footsteps, measured, cautious, echoed on the tiles. Miss Marple's expression softened into its usual pleasant calm. "Good afternoon, Reverend Pritchard," she said gently as the vicar appeared in the doorway, his hand still on the knob. "I did wonder who else might be visiting at such an hour." He started slightly. "Miss Marple, my dear lady, you quite startled me. I came to offer prayers for Lady Agatha's soul. These old houses do hold grief." "Indeed they do," she said, her gaze resting on his hand, "especially when the living have not yet confessed all their part in it." The vicar's fingers twitched. "I don't follow you." "Oh, I think you do," she said kindly. "You were here often enough to see where the clock stood. And Lady Agatha trusted you, didn't she? Enough to tell you she meant to alter her will in favor of the church." His face paled. "She did mention benefactions, yes. But I discouraged her. I had no wish. Only that her nephew not withdraw his patronage from the parish." Miss Marple's tone was as mild as a cup of tea. "Or perhaps you wished both benefactors safe, one in heaven, one generous on earth. A moral dilemma is so much easier to bear when someone else tips the balance." The vicar sank into the nearest chair, trembling. "I never meant to harm her. Stephen said it would frighten her, make her relent. The poison," he said, "was mild, just to make her faint. He promised no real harm would come." "But harm," said Miss Marple softly, "never listens to promises. Once given form, it behaves as it pleases. You kept the clock's secret after his arrest because you feared the church's shame." He bowed his head, voice breaking. "I came back to fix it, to loosen the spring before it gave out. It's been ticking louder each day. I thought if I could undo it quietly, no one would know." Miss Marple nodded. "You see, Reverend, evil is rather like that spring. It tightens until it must strike, and it strikes the one who tries to keep it hidden." There was a sudden sound, a sharp metallic crack. The clock groaned as though sighing after a long strain, then struck, once, twice. Before falling silent, the pendulum stilled. Miss Marple regarded it gravely. "There," she said. "It's quite over now." The vicar buried his face in his hands, whispering words that were half prayer, half despair. Miss Marple went to the window and opened it wide, letting the fresh air in. Beyond the mist, the village bell began to toll the hour, steady and true. She turned back to him, her voice gentle. "You must tell Inspector Lennox what you've told me. A lie may be forgiven in confession, but silence never is." He nodded faintly, the fight gone from him. Miss Marple gathered her gloves and hat, pausing once more beside the clock. "It's a curious thing," she said softly. "We think we measure time by clocks, but it's truth that marks the hours, and truth, Reverend, is very punctual indeed." She stepped outside into the clearing air. The clouds had broken at last, sunlight threading through the branches, warm upon the gravel path. Behind her, Rosewood Hall stood quiet, its great clock forever stilled, its secrets finally spent. and Miss Marple, walking home toward the peaceful lanes of St. Mary Mead, allowed herself the smallest of smiles, gentle, knowing, and tinged, as always, with sorrow for the way people so often mistook their own hearts for innocence. The evening that followed was curiously calm, the sort of quiet that descends upon a place once truth has been spoken aloud. St. Mildred's on the Green seemed to breathe again, yet beneath that calm something delicate remained unsettled, like a final thread still dangling from an otherwise perfect weave. Miss Marple walked home from Rosewood Hall through the twilight, her shoes brushing softly against the damp lane. The vicar's broken confession echoed faintly in her mind, not for its words, but for the tone of his regret. There had been genuine sorrow there, but also something else, fear, not of judgment or prison, but of a promise unfulfilled. The church bells rang vespers as she neared her cottage. The sound was comforting, familiar, yet one note wavered ever so slightly. To most it would have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple's ear, attuned to the subtleties of both people and instruments, caught it immediately. That faint dissonance seemed to follow her as she entered her parlor and set about lighting the lamp. It was only then, as she glanced toward the mantel, that she noticed the envelope slipped through her letterbox. Plain, cream paper, sealed with no mark. She turned it over in her hands. Inside, on a single sheet, was written in neat clerical hand, "Forgive me. The clock will not keep silence." Miss Marple stood very still. Her first thought was of Reverend Pritchard, who by now should have gone to the police as she'd urged. Her second was of the clock itself. Broken, she had thought, when it struck those last two uneven notes. And yet, if the vicar had been too late in releasing its spring, perhaps something within remained alive, something set to trigger again. The letter had been posted only an hour ago. She could almost feel the ink still drying. Without hesitation, she put on her shawl and took the road once more toward the church. The path was slick with evening mist, the stones glistening in the light of her small lantern. As she neared the vicarage, she saw a dim glow through the study window and the outline of a man seated at his desk. The door was unlatched. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candle wax and damp paper. The vicar's hands lay folded on the open Bible before him, his head bowed, not in prayer, but in the stillness of death. The candle beside him had burned to the base. Miss Marple crossed herself quietly and stepped closer. There was no wound, no struggle, only the faint trace of the same bitter scent she had known too well these past days, polish mingled with something acrid. On the desk lay another letter, unfinished, his pen arrested mid-sentence. The hour has come. The clock speaks still. Miss Marple's heart, though steady, gave a small twist of sorrow. The poor man had not taken his own life, she knew. He had been silenced by the very mechanism he sought to undo. The poison's work, though faint in the air, lingered. She opened the window wide and allowed the cool night air to flow in, her mind already moving beyond pity toward the pattern of events. The spring, the note, the fear. The clock had not been the vicar's to mend. Someone else had come before him. At dawn, Inspector Lennox returned from London when word of the vicar's death reached him. His expression was drawn and incredulous. "You mean to tell me," he said, standing by the vicar's desk, "that after all this, the blasted clock's done it again?" "Not the clock itself," Miss Marple said gently, "but rather what it contained. You see, Inspector, deceit is rather like mechanism. If one tampered cog remains engaged, the whole thing can move again." He frowned. "But Redwell's in custody. Hanmer's awaiting trial. The vicar's confession explains the rest. What else is there?" Miss Marple moved to the window. A person who removes guilt from others often leaves traces of their own. It is not the guilty who return to the scene. It is those who feel ownership of it. And there is someone still missing from this tidy tale. Lennox followed her gaze. "You mean the florist?" "Nina Bell," Miss Marple said softly. "She vanished after the fete, you'll recall. We assumed fear sent her fleeing, but perhaps fear was sent after her. They found her that afternoon, not far from the railway station, her bicycle propped against a hedge. She was pale, her expression vacant, and in her hands she clutched a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. When she saw Miss Marple, she gave a trembling half-smile. "I couldn't post it," she said faintly. "Not after I heard about the vicar." "What was it you meant to send, my dear?" Miss Marple asked. Nina hesitated, then handed over the parcel. Inside lay the missing cloth, the one Hanma had claimed to have thrown away. It was stiff with old polish, and its scent made even Lennox flinch. "I found it in my shop," she whispered, folded beneath the roses, as if someone meant me to take the blame. Again. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You've been the thread through it all, haven't you? Lady Agatha's confidant, the florist who carried her messages, the one who saw the roses laid by the clock." "I never knew they'd use it," Nina said. "Stephen told me he'd stop the vicar, that it would all end with her death, but when I saw the letter in his hand at the fete— Oh, Miss Marple, he wasn't alone. Someone else was there before him." Lennox's tone sharpened. "Who?" "I never saw his face," Nina said, shaking her head. "Only his sleeve, dark grey with a pin at the cuff. A small gold cross." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the parish procession, the subtle gleam of that same pin at the bishop's visit, and the figure standing just behind Reverend Pritchard. His curate, young Mr. Elms, devout, earnest, and ambitious. By evening, Lennox had the curate brought in. His manner was composed, almost serene, but when Miss Marple produced the cloth, his composure cracked. "You think you understand," he said bitterly. "But she deserved it. She mocked the church, all of us. She bought absolution with money while the poor went hungry. The Reverend was weak, Stephen greedy. I gave justice a little push, that's all. A turn of the key, time striking where it ought." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "No, Mr. Elms, you mistook revenge for righteousness. The difference is as small and as deadly as the space between one tick and the next." The curate's silence was all the confession they needed. When it was over, Miss Marple stood once more beneath the trees outside Rosewood Hall. The clock inside, now stripped of poison and spring alike, would tick no more. The air smelled of rain and rose petals crushed underfoot. She drew her shawl tighter and smiled faintly at the thought that life, like time, never truly stops. It simply turns toward the next moment. And as she walked back toward the village, the first notes of the church bell rose through the dusk, measured, solemn, and beautifully true. The trial that followed was short, though the echoes of it lingered long after the gavel's fall. The curate, Mr. Elms, confessed fully once the weight of his conscience, or perhaps the futility of denial, pressed upon him. His motive, a tangled knot of righteousness and resentment, shocked even those who thought themselves immune to village scandal. He had sought not wealth, but vindication. To strike at hypocrisy dressed as charity, to cleanse, he said, a moral rot. It was an old story, Miss Marple reflected from the gallery, a tale as ancient as Cain, yet always dressed in new robes. After the verdict, when the court emptied and the murmurs of reporters faded, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor. She had no taste for triumph. Justice, to her mind, was not a matter of victory, but of restoration, a fragile thing, easily bruised. Inspector Lennox found her there, standing near a window that overlooked the square. He removed his hat respectfully, a gesture of genuine regard. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone was gentler than congratulatory. 3 guilty men in one small village. Heaven help us all if crime spreads by parish." She smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, crime is much like mildew. It does not spread by place, but by character. It settles wherever there is dampness of soul." He chuckled despite himself, then sobered. "Elms's confession clears the rest. Hanmer will be spared the worst of it, poor man. The vicar's name will stand untarnished in the records. I am glad of that, she said. He was a kind man who stumbled upon deceit he could not bear to see punished by truth. Many a good Christian has done worse in fear of scandal. Lennox nodded, his expression thoughtful. You think this will set the village right again? For a time, she said. But time, like the clock at Rosewood Hall, always winds itself back to the same questions. We measure hours and seasons, yet people never learn to measure themselves. They parted on that note, the inspector returning to London and Miss Marple to her quiet cottage on the edge of the green. Life resumed its pattern, the chime of the postman's bicycle, the smell of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Carter's shop, the vicarage bell replaced now by a softer voice, a new curate eager to do better than his predecessor. To the outward eye, all was restored. Yet in the evenings, when Miss Marple sat by her fire, she often thought of the letter Reverend Pritchard had written before he died, the one that began, "The clock will not keep silence." He had meant the literal clock, of course, but she knew that truth, once awakened, was the real mechanism that refused to stop. One afternoon in early autumn, Miss Marple received a visit from Nina Bell. The young woman looked different now, still pale, but calmer, her dark eyes less haunted. She carried a small box, neatly wrapped, and placed it upon the table. "It's for you," she said softly. "A way of saying thank you. I've closed my shop, at least for a while. I thought I might start fresh somewhere new." Miss Marple untied the ribbon carefully. Inside lay a delicate timepiece, a miniature clock made of rosewood, its face unmarked by numerals, its hands slender as needles. "It was the Colonel's design," Nina explained. "He'd drawn it for his wife years ago. I found the plans among her things. I had it made by a craftsman in Bath. It seemed right, somehow." Miss Marple traced the wood with a gentle touch. "A fine piece of work," she said, "and a kind thought, but my dear, clocks have had quite enough of me lately. I hope this one will only mark pleasant hours." Nina smiled faintly. "I think it will. I've set it to never chime, just to tick quietly." "A wise choice," said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling. "A reminder that time passes whether we announce it or not." They shared tea and spoke a little of futures, of Nina's plans, of the garden Miss Marple meant to replant come spring. When the girl left, Miss Marple sat a while in silence, the new clock ticking softly beside her. It was an ordinary sound, yet it carried a certain peace, like a heartbeat returning to its rightful pace. As dusk settled, she looked out through her lace curtains toward the green. Children were playing, their laughter rising and falling in waves. Across the way, Mrs. Carter was hanging lanterns for the harvest fete, the same event that, not long ago, had been shattered by death. Time, she mused, was mercifully forgetful, even if people were not. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was the postman, handing her a small envelope bearing the inspector's handwriting. She opened it with mild curiosity. Inside was a single folded note. "Case closed. The clock from Rosewood Hall sent to museum storage. Mechanism incomplete. Thought you'd like to know." Miss Marple smiled, reading between the lines. "Incomplete," she murmured. "Perhaps it was always meant to be." She placed the note beside the rosewood clock, watching the tiny hands move soundlessly beneath the lamplight. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows across the room. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour, clear and even once more. It rang not for death this time, but for ordinary life, the kind Miss Marple valued most. She leaned back, her knitting resting in her lap, her gaze distant but content. In the heart of St. Mildred's, the gossip had turned to other matters. The new school teacher, the grocer's latest scandal, a litter of kittens at the parsonage. No one spoke much of Lady Agatha now, nor of the clock that bore her name. Yet if one listened closely in the quiet hours before dawn, one might imagine the faintest ticking somewhere far off, a whisper of lessons learned, of secrets finally at rest. Miss Marple, hearing it in her dreams, smiled faintly and murmured, "Time's perfume indeed." Then she let the sound fade into sleep, peaceful in the knowledge that though human hearts might falter, time and truth always keep their rhythm. Autumn deepened gently over St. Mildred's on the Green, softening the sharp edges of what had been. The leaves along the church lane had turned to gold, and the air carried that faint scent of wood smoke that makes one think of endings, peaceful, inevitable ones. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with a shawl over her shoulders, watched a pair of sparrows quarrel over crumbs on the sill. Life, she reflected, has a remarkable way of insisting upon itself. Even after death and scandal, the village continued. The grocer still short-weighed his sugar by a pinch, Mrs. Carter still corrected everyone's grammar, and the postman still whistled, always off-key. She had not spoken of the affair at Rosewood Hall in some weeks. The newspapers had moved on, calling it a strange and tragic episode in a quiet parish. But for Miss Marple, the story had never been about tragedy or strangeness. It had been about people, ordinary, well-meaning, fallible people who had let resentment fester until it found the form of a clock. The mechanism of murder, she thought, was rarely more complex than the mechanism of human vanity. That morning, a letter arrived from Inspector Lennox, written in his neat, practical hand. He thanked her for her invaluable insight, though she smiled at the phrasing. He was a man who preferred plain nouns to emotions. He mentioned that the curate, Mr. Elms, had taken to reading scripture in his cell, not for comfort, but in what Lennox called grim self-study. Hanmer had been released, returning to his sister's cottage by the sea, where he was said to spend his days repairing clocks for local sailors. As for Nina Bell, she had gone to Bath after all, to begin anew with a small flower stall near the Crescent. A happier occupation, Lennox wrote, so long as roses remain innocent. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside her teapot, letting the words rest like old lace. Delicate, unnecessary to keep, yet impossible to throw away. That afternoon she walked to the churchyard. The air was still, touched with the warmth of lingering sun. The new curate, a mild young man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, was arranging chrysanthemums near the gate. He greeted her with shy enthusiasm and spoke of the coming harvest service, of hymns and sermons, of hope. Miss Marple listened politely, smiling at his earnestness. She had seen so many of his kind, idealists who believed sin was an argument that could be won rather than a tendency to be endured. She wished him luck, though in her heart she knew the world would always offer him more sermons than solutions. As she moved through the graves, she paused at one freshly carved stone. Reverend Samuel Pritchard, a shepherd beloved. Someone had left a single white rose upon it. Miss Marple regarded it thoughtfully, remembering the florist's trembling hands, the scent of polish that had lingered too long, and the slow, inevitable tolling of that fatal clock. "We all keep our own time," she murmured. "Some clocks strike early." She bent slightly, set the flower straight, and continued along the path. At the far end of the yard, the great tower clock struck the hour. Its tone was clear and even, untroubled now. The craftsman who had cleaned and repaired it after the scandal had commented that the mechanism was remarkably fine work for so small a parish. Yet Miss Marple knew it was more than craftsmanship that gave the bell its steadiness. It was simply that every deception, once uncovered, leaves silence behind, and silence has its own rhythm. Later that evening she returned home to find her parlor bathed in the golden light of early dusk. The small rosewood clock Nina Bell had gifted her stood on the mantel, ticking softly. Its sound was neither intrusive nor insistent, but companionable, like a cat purring nearby. She poured herself a cup of tea, added just one lump of sugar, and settled into her chair. For the first time in many months, she felt no need to think further. The pieces of the puzzle had found their places, and the story, as stories must, had closed itself. Yet closure, she reflected, was not quite the same as peace. There would always be new whispers in St. Mildred's, the petty jealousies, the small deceits, the gentle cruelties exchanged over teacups. That was the nature of life, and she bore it no malice. Human weakness, she thought, was a most reliable thing. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, noticed it before it did harm. That had been her task for years, not to judge, not even to forgive, but simply to see. The lamplight caught the gleam of the clock's face. Its hands pointed precisely to 8, and Miss Marple smiled at the thought that somewhere Inspector Lennox might be sitting at his own desk, glancing at his watch, wondering if the quiet lady of St. Mary Mead, or St. Mildred's now, as he sometimes joked, was already halfway through her evening tea. Perhaps, she thought, he would remember her words about clocks and character, and understand them a little better now. Outside, a soft wind stirred the hedges. The sound blended with the faint ticking, the two rhythms joining like a heartbeat and breath. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself the luxury of stillness. The village would call upon her again one day, of that she had no doubt. There would always be another small mystery wrapped in the ordinary, another bit of human nature disguised as coincidence. But tonight, at least, time belonged to peace. When the hour hand moved forward and the tiny clock struck once, a modest, almost shy chime, she lifted her head, listening. It was a simple sound, yet it carried everything that had been, and all that was to come. The folly, the justice, the endless turning of days. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "Well," she said softly, "the clock keeps good time at last." Then she poured the last of her tea, reached for her knitting, and began a new pattern, steady, precise, and endlessly patient, while the world outside turned quietly on, each tick marking not an end, but a beginning disguised, as always, in the ordinary.